Hi students, the last type of authoritarian regime we're going to talk about in this section is military regime. So a term that comes up oftentimes when you're talking about military regimes is coup d'etat. That means an overthrow of a regime. It could be a military regime or a democratic regime by a military group. The countries I'm going to talk about in this segment are quite a lot. A lot of the Southeast Asian countries that I work on in my research have had a lot of military regimes. You can just see some of the dates there, but we'll talk about Thailand, Burma or Myanmar, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. To tell you how common these regimes are, Thailand has a joke. It's we don't have general elections, we elect generals. So why does the military get involved in politics? I mean, can you imagine tomorrow the U.S. military just kind of taking over the national government? Well, in some countries that's very, very common. When I put this question to some of my friends in Indonesia or other places, they turn the question around and they say, why on earth would you expect the military not to be involved in politics? Indonesia actually had a doctrine during its long authoritarian regime. It was called dui fungsi, or dual function, and it said that the military explicitly had a security and a political and economic function. So in many countries there's no tradition of separation of the military and civilian government as we have here. The military is often very strong too because it participated in the country's national liberation struggle. Now, why does the military intervene in politics? Western political scientist, Harvard's Samuel Huntington said, militaries intervene in politics because they lack professionalism. Okay? Now this isn't the world's best explanation because it's something we call tautological. It means it uses circular reasoning. So the tautology is the military isn't professional, so it intervenes in politics. How do we know it isn't professional? Because it intervenes in politics. Now, things to think about in regards to the military. To understand a country's military and its proclivity for coups, you would want to know how officers are promoted. Are they promoted based on merit, by different ethnic groups, family connections, or political lines? Sometimes inequities can lead to gripes. We also need to know about the corporate interests of the military as a body. Sometimes if a civilian leader interferes in military affairs, say tries to cut the military's budget or move military leaders aside, the military will interfere in order to protect itself. We'd also want to know things about the identity of the officer corps. Who do the officers in this military think that they are serving? Is it the nation? Is it one particular ethnic group? Or is it an ideology? This can be really important in whether the officers launch a coup. So I'd ask you to pause the video right here and think about, maybe write down 3 things that you think are the sources of military power. I hope you came up with some of the following. They've got guns to enforce their will. Something that might not have struck you, though, is that militaries are usually, in a lot of developing countries, the most advanced, efficient, modern, professional organization that exists. The best educated, and one of the best financed. I said this to one of my Indonesian students one day, a long time ago, and he mentioned the uniform, so I always include that. He said that gave the military in Indonesia power because it was respected. The military is disciplined and able to be an effective actor. U.S. aid also has been significant in a lot of the countries that I'm talking about today. The U.S. gave aid to a lot of these countries, with the exception of Burma. A lot of these countries in Southeast Asia were allies in the fight against communism. So U.S. money backstopped these militaries. These militaries tended to take over the government. The military also is very successful and skillful at portraying its interest as the interest of the nation. So it says, we're not intervening for ourselves, we're intervening to save the nation. Also, that leading the national liberation struggle gives them prestige, that they can used like a currency against other groups in politics. So let's say there's a military coup. Why does the military say that it takes over? These are just some of the common things. So if you ever hear of a coup, look through the military leader's statement, and I bet you'll hear one of these justifications. They say that the democratic government was chaotic, and they'll say sometimes it's only temporary. They'll say the military is above politics, so they're coming in to save the nation. They'll say they're fighting communism, or protecting the nation from internal or external threats. Today that might include things like jihadists. They'll say that they're ascetic modernizers, that they don't care about the trappings of power, that they want to bring development to the country. They'll cite the incompetence of civilian regimes, and sometimes that's not very hard. Sometimes they'll make a case that the Western liberal democracy that the country was trying to put into place just doesn't work with the indigenous culture. We saw this in both Burma and Indonesia, for example. So what happens in reality? Why do military coups occur? Sometimes the system just gets overloaded. You know, democracy is a system to make decisions. It's a system by which you can peacefully make decisions, change power, change policies. But sometimes it doesn't always work. Bangladesh is a great example here. Over the last decade or so, we've had the two party leaders who happen to be women, Sheikh Hasina and Khaleda Zia, and they are phenomenally incompetent. They have seemed to want to bring the country to chaos in order to battle with each other. And that's the kind of thing that leads the military to step in. Sometimes the military wants more resources, or at a minimum, control over the resources it does have. I mentioned this before. Sometimes you might find this surprising. It's not always civilian guys bad, civilian guys good, military guys bad. Sometimes civilians who are out of power will align themselves with the military interest in order to advance themselves. So we saw this in Thailand in the 1990s. We had angel parties that were outside the military order, and devil parties that were willing to collaborate. These are Thai terms that they've used to describe these parties. Sometimes one thing that happens is civilians they get so afraid that a military coup is coming that they'll try to move officers around to prevent the coup, and they'll wind up triggering the coup that they didn't want to see happen. This happened in Pakistan back in late 1990s. The prime minister thought a coup was coming, tried to remove the head of the armed forces, and he wound up, in order to save his own neck, launching a coup and ruling the country for the better part of a decade. Why else? The Cold War was important in a lot of these coup stories, but it's not the entirety, right? Because we still see coups even today, with the Cold War 20 years over. But the U.S. Supported a lot of these militaries. Our philosophy was, we're in a battle with communism, and the military regimes are the ones on our side. We have a shorthand saying it like, he's our son of a bitch. He's the one that works with us. Okay. Now, overall, in the developing world, if we look across many countries, research has shown that the military is no more successful at administering these countries than civilian governments are in total. Okay? Typically, just like everybody else, the military rules in its own interest and for its own power. Think for a second about whether military coups are always a bad thing. I think our default answer to that question is that they are. However, it's important to think and to understand that for people in developing countries, sometimes a coup can be a relief. The government is chaotic or corrupt, and people look to a military coup as a solution to problems. I had a friend back in the 1990s. She stood up to give a presentation and talked about how stable Thailand was. And it was quite funny. She was Thai, and it was quite funny because Thailand had just had a military coup. But to somebody like her, the country was still stable, and actually probably better off, would have been her opinion at that time. Just to teach you a little vocabulary word, sometimes a ruling military council that takes over in wake of a coup is called a junta. Right? If you ever hear that term, you'll know what it means. So, just to take a quick look at the country of Thailand, to understand these kind of military and politics dynamics. Thailand had no anti-colonial struggle. The country was never taken over by Western powers. And so there was no mobilization of society to fight the colonialists. What this wound up doing, though, is it did leave the military in a dominant position, like in other countries, where the military is the only organized interest in society. The absolute monarchy in Thailand was overthrown by the military in a coup d'etat in 1932. Since then, Thailand has continued to have a monarchy, but just no longer an absolute. Under its military rulers in the 1960s, the country started to experience rapid economic development. There were education and new social forces. The students became politicized, and by the 1970s they were out in the streets protesting and managed to secure a short period of democracy. Usually Thailand's coups have not been bloody, but there was one particularly bloody one back in 1973. After 1973, the military came to power and stayed in power for a while because of the communist victories in Indochina. Thailand is right on the border with Cambodia and Laos, and those countries have fallen to communism in 1975. And so the military said, you know, the country's under threat, and so we must stay in power. Coming to the late 1980s, though, Thailand had new educated groups who wanted to participate in politics, and democracy sort of gradually took hold. The country was corrupt, but prospering. The country has had 19 coups since 1932. The most recent ones were, as I've mentioned, in 1991, 2006, and then 2014. The gentleman in the picture here is Thailand's current military ruler, General Prayut Chan-o-cha. This is a picture that comes from 1992 in the wake of some bloodshed when the military violently put down people who were protesting against its rule. What you can see here is Thailand's king, and I'm sorry it's fuzzy, this is a picture that was taken off Thailand television. You can see the king who's sitting in a room, and he's sitting with the general who's wearing civilian clothes, who was ruling at that time, and who was seen as responsible for that massacre. Next to him, on the far left, is the man who was leading the protests. Interestingly, in Thailand's case, the king brought both of them before him, you know, and you can see their position on the floor in relation to him. He's showing that they're both inferior to him, and he makes them both accept responsibility. He makes the protest leader accept responsibility for kind of ramping it up too much, and he expects the general to accept responsibility for the blood as well. Thailand has continued to be unstable, and that's why we see coups again in 2006 and 2014. The gentleman in the picture here is Thaksin Shinawatra. He kept getting elected to office. Then the military threw him out. He put his sister in power. You can see her there. And the military threw her out. Thailand currently, democracy has not been able to solve Thai problems, and the military continues to step in and take over power. I'd ask you to take just a minute to complete this lecture and take a look at those factors for analysis of non-democratic regimes: the size of this electorate, the criteria for admission, the rules for selection of leaders, and the rules governing the use of power. This concludes our presentation.